HOA board members laughed at my flood wall and called it useless, but minutes later, rising water forced them to face the disaster I had warned them about. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The sound of rushing water was the last thing they expected to hear after laughing at the wall they called a joke. I still remember standing near the edge of my property, watching the rain fall harder than anyone predicted. The sky above Riverstone Valley Estates had turned dark, the kind of heavy gray that makes you feel like nature is warning you before it acts. But the most unforgettable part wasn't the storm. It was remembering the faces of the HOA board members weeks earlier when they stood in front of my flood wall and laughed. My name is Nathan Brooks, and I never built that wall to prove anyone wrong. I built it because I understood something they refused to see. Water always follows the easiest path. And when people ignore that fact, nature doesn't care about their opinions, their titles, or their rules. It only follows physics. When I first moved to Riverstone Valley Estates, I thought I had found the perfect place to slow down. After years of working as an environmental construction engineer, I wanted a quieter life. I wanted mornings with my family, evenings outside, and a community where neighbors respected each other. The area was beautiful. Wide streets, mature trees, homes built around a peaceful valley surrounded by natural drainage areas. But that beauty came with a hidden problem. The land had a history of collecting water during heavy storms. I noticed it almost immediately. Small signs most people ignored. The way rainwater moved after a storm. The areas where soil stayed wet longer than others. The direction water naturally traveled across the neighborhood. To most people, those details meant nothing. To me, they were warnings. I started researching the area. I reviewed old weather records. I studied the terrain around my property. The information was clear. A serious storm could create significant flooding problems if nothing was done. So I made a decision. I designed a flood wall around the most vulnerable side of my property. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to attract attention. It was practical. It was built carefully, following proper guidelines, and focusing on protection. I didn't expect everyone to understand it, but I expected people to respect the reason behind it. I was wrong. The first time Caroline Whitaker, the HOA board president, saw the construction, she walked onto my property line with two other board members. She looked at the structure, then looked back at me with a smile that told me exactly what she thought. "Nathan," she said, "are you seriously building this?" I explained why I was doing it. I showed her the information I had collected. I explained the drainage concerns and the possibility of future storms. She listened, but not because she wanted to understand. She was waiting for her turn to respond. "This neighborhood doesn't need things like this," she said. "It makes the area look extreme." I told her my goal wasn't appearance. My goal was safety. But Caroline wasn't interested in the data. She was interested in how things looked and whether they matched the image she wanted for Riverstone Valley Estates. A few days later, the HOA sent me a notice questioning the flood wall. They claimed it affected the community's appearance and needed further review. I read the letter carefully and placed it beside my records. I wasn't angry. I wasn't surprised. I had seen this before. Sometimes people reject solutions simply because they didn't come from them. Caroline believed the wall was unnecessary because she couldn't see the danger I could see, and she had no idea that the same structure she mocked would soon become the only thing standing between my home and the water she refused to believe was coming. The first mistake Caroline Whitaker made was believing that anything she didn't personally approve of had no value. She looked at my flood wall and saw an eyesore. I looked at it and saw protection. That difference in perspective became the reason our conflict grew into something much bigger than a simple HOA disagreement. After receiving the first notice from the HOA, I decided not to react emotionally. I knew exactly how situations like this could develop. When someone feels their authority is being questioned, they often stop listening and start defending their position. So I did what I always did when facing uncertainty. I gathered information. I reviewed the HOA guidelines. I checked the permits connected to my project. I documented every conversation and every notice I received. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was preparing for the possibility that someone would eventually ask for the truth. The flood wall was not built overnight. It took planning, research, and careful consideration. I worked with the right professionals to make sure everything was done properly. I studied the drainage patterns around my property and looked at how water moved during previous storms. The signs were there. The land was telling a story, even if people refused to listen. But Caroline didn't see preparation. She saw a challenge to her authority. A few weeks after the first notice, she called an HOA meeting to discuss my flood wall. When I arrived, I could immediately feel the atmosphere. The room was filled with residents who wanted to know what was happening. Caroline stood at the front with her documents organized neatly in front of her. She had the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. "This structure is unnecessary," she told the group. "It changes the appearance of our community and creates concerns for our neighborhood standards." I listened quietly while she explained her position. Then I was given a chance to speak. I showed the information I had collected. I explained the drainage concerns. I talked about the increasing storms in the area and why preparation mattered. I wasn't trying to scare anyone. I was trying to help them understand. But Caroline dismissed everything. "Nathan, we appreciate your concern," she said. "But the HOA cannot allow every homeowner to make decisions based on personal opinions." That sentence stayed with me. Because she wasn't talking about safety anymore. She was talking about control. I wasn't asking for special treatment. I wasn't ignoring the rules. I had followed the proper steps. I simply believed that protecting a home from potential damage was more important than keeping everything visually perfect. After the meeting, a few neighbors approached me privately. They admitted they had noticed the same drainage issues, but never looked into them further. Some told me they respected the effort I had made. Others were hesitant because they didn't want problems with the HOA. I understood their concern. Most people don't want conflict where they live. They want quiet lives. They want peaceful neighborhoods. But peace should never depend on ignoring obvious problems. Over the next several days, Caroline continued pushing back. More emails arrived. More questions were sent about the flood wall. Every message focused on appearance and community standards, but none addressed the actual risk I had identified. That was when I realized something important. Caroline wasn't trying to determine whether the wall was necessary. She was trying to prove that she was the person who had the final say. She believed the HOA board had more authority than practical experience. She believed paperwork mattered more than preparation. What she didn't understand was that nature doesn't negotiate. Water doesn't care about HOA meetings. Storms don't follow community guidelines. When the conditions are right, water will always find a way through. And I knew the storm I had been preparing for was closer than anyone realized. The moment I realized Caroline Whitaker would never understand the purpose of my flood wall was the moment I stopped trying to convince her. Some people don't reject an idea because the idea is wrong. They reject it because accepting it means admitting someone else saw something they missed. And Caroline was not willing to admit that. After the HOA meeting, the pressure increased. The board sent additional notices claiming the flood wall created unnecessary concerns for the community. The wording was careful, but the message was obvious. They wanted me to remove it. They wanted me to believe their opinion mattered more than the research, planning, and preparation behind the structure. I read every letter carefully and placed each one in the folder on my desk. That folder was becoming a complete record of everything that had happened. The warnings, the emails, the meeting notes, the conversations. I wasn't collecting them because I wanted revenge. I was collecting them because facts matter when people start changing the story. That was something I learned throughout my career. Details reveal the truth when emotions try to hide it. A few days later, Caroline stopped by my property again. This time, she arrived with another HOA board member. She stood near the flood wall and looked at it with the same expression she had the first time. Disapproval. "Nathan, we need to discuss this again," she said. I asked her what had changed. She looked surprised by the question. "The board has concerns," she replied. "Concerns about what?" I asked. She pointed toward the wall. "This structure sends the wrong message. It makes people think our community has problems." That answer told me everything I needed to know. Caroline wasn't worried about whether the flood wall worked. She was worried about what people might think if they saw it. She cared more about the appearance of safety than actual safety. I looked at the wall behind her and thought about all the hours spent researching, designing, and building it. I remembered the rainfall data I reviewed, the drainage patterns I studied, the areas where water naturally collected after storms. None of that mattered to Caroline because she had already decided what she believed. A wall doesn't create a problem, I told her. It prepares for one. She shook her head. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. I had heard that phrase many times before. People often say something is complicated when they don't want to examine the details. But nature doesn't simplify itself because people ignore warning signs. Over the next few weeks, dark clouds began appearing more often over Riverstone Valley. Weather reports started mentioning a stronger storm system moving toward our area. I watched the updates carefully. I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel like I was winning. I felt concerned. Because the purpose of the flood wall was never to prove Caroline wrong. The purpose was to prevent damage. I hoped I was wrong. I hoped the storm would weaken and the wall would never need to prove its value. But preparation means accepting possibilities others don't want to consider. The day before the storm arrived, I walked around my property and inspected everything one more time. The wall was secure. The drainage paths were clear. Everything was ready. Meanwhile, the HOA continued acting as if the biggest issue in the neighborhood was the appearance of one homeowner's protection system. Caroline even made a comment during a community discussion that people repeated to me afterward. She said the flood wall was a dramatic solution looking for a problem. Some neighbors laughed. Others simply stayed quiet. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to explain. Soon, everyone would see the difference between someone preparing for a problem and someone pretending the problem didn't exist. The morning the storm arrived, the entire neighborhood felt different. There was a heaviness in the air that everyone could sense. The sky above Riverstone Valley Estates was darker than usual. The wind moved faster through the trees, and the sound of rain hitting rooftops became constant. I stood outside for a few minutes watching the water begin to collect in the areas I had warned people about. I wasn't excited. I wasn't waiting for anyone to admit I was right. I was hoping the storm would pass without causing serious damage. Because the truth was, a flood wall is not something you build because you want a disaster to happen. You build it because you understand what could happen if one does. Throughout the day, the rain became heavier. Weather alerts started appearing on everyone's phones. The local news warned residents about possible flooding in low-lying areas. Neighbors who had once ignored my concerns started paying closer attention. Some walked outside and looked toward the streets. Others checked their yards and drainage areas. For the first time, people were looking at the environment around them instead of just the appearance of their homes. I watched the water move across the neighborhood, following the natural paths I had studied months earlier. It was doing exactly what I expected. Water always looks for the easiest route. It moves around obstacles. It gathers where the ground allows it. It follows patterns that don't change just because people refuse to acknowledge them. My property was prepared. The flood wall was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Water collected near the barrier, slowed down, and moved toward the proper drainage areas instead of rushing toward my home. I stood there watching it work, and I thought about every conversation where I tried to explain why it mattered. But there was no satisfaction in being right. Not when I could see the situation developing around me. Across the neighborhood, things were very different. Areas without proper preparation started showing the first signs of trouble. Water moved across yards. Driveways began filling. Some residents who had once laughed about the flood wall were now standing outside with worried expressions. Then I received a call from one of my neighbors. His voice sounded different from usual. "Nathan, the water is getting higher near the entrance road." I looked toward the street and saw what he meant. The drainage system was struggling with the amount of water coming in. More rain was still falling. I told him to stay safe and avoid walking through flooded areas. Safety mattered more than proving any point. A short time later, another message came through. This one was from someone who had attended the HOA meeting where Caroline dismissed my concerns. "I think you were right about the drainage." I read the message but didn't respond immediately. Not because I was angry, because there was nothing to say. The storm was answering the question everyone had been debating. Meanwhile, Caroline Whitaker and the HOA Board were facing the reality they had ignored. The same flood risk they called unnecessary was now affecting the community. The same preparation they criticized was now protecting the one property they had questioned. By evening, the rain became relentless. Water moved through parts of Riverstone Valley Estates faster than anyone expected. Emergency vehicles began appearing in nearby areas. Residents were calling for information. The HOA board that once focused on the appearance of my flood wall was now dealing with a much bigger problem. And as I looked across the neighborhood from behind the barrier they had mocked, I realized something important. The flood wall was never about proving them wrong. It was about being ready when the moment came. And that moment had finally arrived. By the time the storm reached its strongest point, nobody in Riverstone Valley Estates was talking about appearances anymore. Nobody was discussing whether my flood wall looked unusual or whether it matched the neighborhood's image. The only thing people cared about was the water moving faster than anyone expected. I stood near my property watching the rain fall in heavy waves while the flood wall continued doing exactly what it was designed to do. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some impossible solution. It was simply a barrier built from planning, research, and preparation. And now, in the middle of the storm, the difference between preparation and denial was becoming impossible to ignore. Across the neighborhood, the situation was changing quickly. Water began collecting around streets and low areas where I knew it would naturally move. Some residents who once questioned my decisions were now calling each other, trying to understand what was happening. The same people who had listened quietly during HOA meetings were now seeing the problem with their own eyes. Nature had removed the argument from the conversation. There was no longer a debate about whether the risk existed. The risk was there. The water proved it. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Marcus Reynolds, a local engineer I had spoken with before building the flood wall. He had reviewed my plans during the early stages and understood the reasoning behind the design. "Nathan," he said, "I'm looking at the drainage situation. Your calculations were accurate." I looked out at the water moving along the protected side of my property. I didn't feel proud in the way people might expect. I didn't feel like celebrating someone else's mistake. I simply felt relieved that the preparation had worked. That was always the goal. Not winning an argument. Not making Caroline Whitaker look foolish. Protecting what mattered. As the storm continued, the HOA board found themselves dealing with the exact situation they had dismissed. Caroline, who had once called the flood wall unnecessary, was now walking through the community trying to understand why the water levels were rising so quickly. The confidence she carried during those earlier meetings was gone. In its place was concern. For the first time, she wasn't looking at the flood wall as a problem. She was looking at it as proof that someone had taken the danger seriously. One of my neighbors later told me he saw Caroline standing near the entrance road, staring at the flooding. She wasn't saying much. She was just watching. Maybe she was remembering all the times she had dismissed the warnings. Maybe she was realizing that the person she thought was creating a problem had actually been preparing for one. That evening, the rain finally began to slow. The damage across some parts of the neighborhood was clear. Several yards had standing water. Some homes had experienced flooding near their entrances. Residents were exhausted and frustrated. But my property remained protected. The flood wall had done its job. The following day, people began checking on each other. Neighbors walked through the streets discussing what happened. The conversations were different now. There was less judgment and more curiosity. People wanted to understand what I had seen before the storm arrived. I explained the same things I had explained before. Drainage, terrain, preparation. None of it was secret information. The answers had always been available. They simply weren't listened to. Caroline eventually came to my property. She stood near the wall quietly for a moment before speaking. Her voice was different from before. There was no confidence meant to overpower the conversation. There was uncertainty. "I didn't think it would happen like this," she said. I looked at the flood wall and then back at her. I knew that moment wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about recognizing the lesson the storm had forced everyone to learn. Sometimes the things people laugh at today are the things they depend on tomorrow. The storm eventually passed, but the lesson it left behind continued spreading through Riverstone Valley Estates. For years, people had looked at problems based on what they could immediately see. They judged appearances. They trusted familiar opinions. They believed that if something looked unusual, it must be unnecessary. My flood wall challenged that way of thinking. It wasn't beautiful in the way Caroline Whitaker wanted beauty to look. It wasn't designed to impress anyone walking through the neighborhood. It was designed for one purpose: protection. And after the storm, nobody could deny that anymore. The days following the flooding were filled with cleanup and conversations. Residents walked through affected areas, checking on neighbors and helping wherever they could. The mood of the community had changed. People who once stayed silent during HOA discussions were now asking questions. They wanted to understand why certain warnings had been ignored and why practical solutions were dismissed so quickly. The flood was not just a weather event. It revealed how decisions were being made inside the community. Caroline had always believed the HOA Board's authority came from its ability to create rules. But after the storm, residents began to understand that leadership required something more. It required listening. It required considering information, even when that information challenged existing beliefs. A few days after the storm, the HOA held an emergency meeting. This meeting felt completely different from the ones before. There was no casual dismissal of concerns. There was no confidence that every decision from the board would automatically be accepted. People came prepared. They brought questions. They brought records. They wanted answers. Caroline sat at the front of the room with the same documents she had used during previous meetings. But this time, those papers did not create the same authority they once did. The residents had experienced the consequences of ignoring the warning signs. They had seen the difference between a rule written on paper and a solution built from reality. During the meeting, Marcus Reynolds presented information about the drainage issues affecting the neighborhood. He explained how water moved through the area and why certain properties were more vulnerable during heavy storms. He also explained that the flood wall on my property had been designed based on practical considerations and proper planning. Hearing that from an independent professional changed the conversation. It was no longer just my opinion against the HOA Board's opinion. It was about facts. Caroline listened quietly while the discussion continued. I could tell she was processing everything differently than before. The person who once laughed at the idea of preparation was now hearing experts explain why preparation mattered. Eventually, she addressed the residents. Her words were more careful than usual. She admitted that the board had underestimated the flooding risk. She didn't make a dramatic apology. She didn't suddenly become a completely different person. But for the first time, she acknowledged that mistakes had been made. That moment mattered because accountability does not always arrive with a grand speech. Sometimes it begins with a simple admission that something could have been handled differently. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me. They thanked me for staying calm throughout the situation. They told me they appreciated that I never turned the conflict into a personal attack against Caroline or the HOA. I told them the truth. I never wanted anyone to fail. I wanted people to prepare. I wanted the community to recognize that safety should always matter more than appearances. Looking back, the flood wall became more than a structure beside my home. It became a reminder of something many people forget. Preparation often looks unnecessary before the moment it becomes essential. And sometimes, the person everyone doubts is the person who has already seen what is coming. The most surprising part about what happened after the storm was not that people changed their opinion about my flood wall. It was realizing how quickly a community can change when people finally see the difference between authority and responsibility. Before the flooding, many residents believed the HOA board had the final word on every issue. They assumed questioning decisions would only create unnecessary conflict. But after the water rushed through parts of Riverstone Valley Estates, people began looking at things differently. They started asking a simple question: were decisions being made because they were truly best for the community, or because someone wanted control over the conversation? I never wanted the storm to prove me right. I would have preferred everyone to be prepared before any damage happened. But sometimes reality teaches lessons that warnings cannot. In the weeks after the flood, the neighborhood began rebuilding. Damaged landscaping was repaired. Water-damaged areas were cleaned. Families helped each other restore what they could. Through all of it, I noticed something important. People were no longer talking about my flood wall as a strange addition to the neighborhood. They were talking about it as an example of what preparation could accomplish. Some neighbors who had once avoided the topic came to ask questions. They wanted to know how I recognized the risk, what information I used, and why I decided to take action before everyone else saw the problem. I explained that there was no secret. I simply paid attention. The land showed warning signs. The weather records showed patterns. The drainage system showed limitations. The answers were there for anyone willing to look. One afternoon, Marcus Reynolds visited my property again. He walked along the flood wall, inspecting the structure after the storm. He looked at the areas where water had collected and reviewed how effectively the barrier had redirected the flow. After a few minutes, he turned to me and nodded. "You built this for exactly the reason you said you did," he told me. Hearing that meant something because Marcus understood the technical side of the situation. He wasn't judging the wall by appearance. He was looking at whether it performed its purpose. That was the difference between his perspective and Caroline Whitaker's. Marcus saw a solution. Caroline saw something she couldn't control. Over time, the HOA board started making changes. They created better procedures for reviewing resident concerns. They began consulting professionals before dismissing ideas that seemed unusual. The biggest change wasn't a new rule or a new document. It was the willingness to listen. Caroline remained involved with the HOA, but her approach became different. She asked more questions before making decisions. She considered information instead of immediately rejecting it. I don't know if the storm completely changed her perspective, but I know it forced her to see something she had ignored before. Experience matters. Knowledge matters. And sometimes the person who raises a concern is not creating a problem. Sometimes they are the first person trying to solve one. Looking back, I think about the moment Caroline stood beside my flood wall and called it unnecessary. She believed she was protecting the image of the community. She believed I was creating something that made the neighborhood look weak. But she misunderstood the purpose of preparation. Preparation does not admit weakness. It recognizes reality. A seatbelt does not mean you expect a crash. A fire extinguisher does not mean you expect a fire. And a flood wall does not mean you want to flood. It means you understand that being ready is better than being surprised. The storm changed many things in Riverstone Valley Estates. But the biggest change was not the repaired roads or restored yards. It was the understanding that sometimes the person everyone questions is the person who saw the danger first. After the storm, the flood wall remained in the same place, but the way people looked at it had completely changed. The structure itself had not become stronger overnight. The materials had not changed. The design had not changed. What changed was the understanding behind it. People finally saw that the wall was never about making a statement. It was about responding to a risk that had always existed. For months, Caroline Whitaker and the HOA board had focused on how the flood wall looked. After the storm, everyone focused on what it had done. That difference became the most important lesson from everything that happened. I never expected the situation to become as large as it did. When I first noticed the flooding risks around Riverstone Valley Estates, I wasn't trying to challenge anyone. I wasn't trying to expose the HOA. I wasn't trying to become the person who proved everyone else wrong. I was simply doing what I believed any responsible homeowner should do. I was paying attention. I was preparing. But preparation can sometimes be misunderstood by people who have never experienced the reason behind it. That was exactly what happened with Caroline. She saw the flood wall as a problem because she only saw the present moment. She saw construction. She saw a change in appearance. She saw something that did not match her idea of the perfect neighborhood. What she didn't see was the future possibility that I had been preparing for. The storm revealed that difference clearly. In the weeks after the flooding, the HOA board faced many questions from residents. People wanted to understand why certain concerns had been dismissed so quickly. They wanted to know why practical information had been ignored before the disaster happened. Those questions were not about blaming one person. They were about making sure the same mistake would not happen again. The community had learned something important. A strong neighborhood is not built by pretending problems do not exist. It is built by recognizing challenges and finding solutions before they become emergencies. I attended several meetings after the storm, but I never used those moments to criticize Caroline. That was never my goal. I knew what it felt like to have someone dismiss your perspective, but I also knew that real improvement comes from understanding, not humiliation. If Caroline learned from the experience, then the entire community benefited. Over time, the conversations became more productive. Residents shared concerns earlier. The HOA board reviewed information more carefully. Professionals were consulted before decisions were made. Small changes began creating a much healthier relationship between the board and the people it represented. One evening, while standing near the flood wall as the sun went down, I thought about how different everything looked compared to that first day. Back then, Caroline stood there believing the wall represented a problem. Now it represented a lesson. The same structure she once called unnecessary had protected my home and changed the way the community thought about preparation. That moment reminded me of something I had learned throughout my life. People often judge things before they understand them. They judge the person who speaks up. They judge the idea that seems unusual. They judge the solution that looks different from what they expected. But reality does not care about assumptions. Reality reveals what works when the pressure arrives. The flood wall did not need to defend itself with words. It simply stood there when the storm came. And sometimes, that is the strongest answer anyone can give. Years after the storm, people in Riverstone Valley Estates still talked about the flood wall, but they no longer talked about it the way they did before. They didn't call it unnecessary. They didn't question why it existed. They understood the reason behind it. The wall had become a reminder that preparation often looks strange to people who have never experienced the danger you are preparing for. But when that danger arrives, the value becomes impossible to ignore. Looking back, I realized the flood was never really about water. The water was only the event that exposed everything underneath. It exposed the importance of listening. It exposed the weakness of making decisions based only on appearances. And it exposed the difference between having authority and having responsibility. Caroline Whitaker had a position. She had a title. She had the ability to send notices and organize meetings. But those things alone did not make someone a leader. Leadership requires humility. It requires the willingness to consider information, even when that information challenges your own beliefs. That was the lesson the storm left behind. I still remember the first time Caroline stood beside my flood wall and laughed at it. She believed it represented unnecessary concern. She believed I was overreacting. She believed the HOA board understood the community better than one homeowner who had spent years studying the environment around him. But the truth was much simpler. I was not trying to control the neighborhood. I was trying to protect my home. I was not trying to prove I was smarter than everyone else. I was trying to prepare for a possibility that eventually became reality. The most meaningful part of the entire experience was not seeing people admit I was right. It was seeing people understand why preparation matters. A few neighbors later told me they started looking at their own properties differently. They checked drainage areas. They paid attention to weather patterns. They asked more questions before assuming something was unnecessary. That was the change I hoped for from the beginning. Not victory over someone else. Awareness. Communities become stronger when people are willing to share knowledge instead of dismissing it. They become safer when experience and information are valued instead of ignored. As for Caroline, I never expected an apology or a dramatic moment where she admitted everything she had done wrong. Life rarely works that way. Sometimes people change slowly. Sometimes the best outcome is simply that they see something differently than before. And I believe that happened. The woman who once saw my flood wall as a problem eventually saw it as proof that preparation had value. The HOA board that once focused on appearance began paying more attention to practical solutions. The community moved forward. One evening, I stood beside the flood wall again while the sun disappeared behind the trees. The same place where Caroline once criticized my decision was now quiet and peaceful. I placed my hand on the wall and thought about everything it represented. It represented patience. It represented responsibility. It represented the importance of trusting knowledge even when others doubt you. The wall never argued with anyone. It never defended itself. It never demanded recognition. It simply did what it was built to do when the moment came. And that is something I have learned throughout my life. Real solutions do not need applause before they are needed. Real preparation does not require approval from everyone. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is protect what matters, even when others do not understand why. Because when the storm finally arrives, the truth always finds a way through.